Folks, bullying works. Don't ever let anybody tell you otherwise. That's right. Bullying works, and it seems to be working on Stephanie White. The front office, I tell you this every day, they are chronically online. They are chronically looking at the feedback, whether they want to take heed to the feedback, whether they want to accept the feedback. That's a story for another day. But I am 99% sure they see it. That's why you often see people like Amber Cox trolling us so often. That's why we see the Indiana Fever Twitter page trolling us so often.
No, there is absolutely no way to ignore what just happened in that press conference. Because what viewers watched was the head coach of the Indiana Fever, the team that employs arguably the biggest star in basketball right now, reacting to a legitimate question about a league-issued warning like she was being personally inconvenienced. My reaction is, for what? That response didn't come across as professional, transparent, or accountable. It sounded like someone who had no interest in explaining the situation and even less interest in respecting the question being asked. I'm Dre Fiber, you're watching Street Hoops, and today we're breaking down one of the most awkward and revealing press conference moments the Indiana Fever have had all season. Stephanie White suddenly finds herself under real scrutiny. The WNBA issued a warning connected to the handling of Caitlin Clark's injury report. Reporter James Boyd asked the questions almost nobody else in that room seemed willing to ask. And somehow, in the middle of all the tension, Stephanie White even managed to compliment Caitlin Clark, which, given the way this season has unfolded, felt rare enough to qualify as a solar eclipse. Now let's explain the situation clearly, because context matters here. The Indiana Fever reportedly received a warning from the WNBA league office regarding the timing and handling of Caitlin Clark's injury report. Injury reports exist for a reason in professional sports. They are not optional suggestions. They are league requirements designed to provide accurate information to fans, media, players, and sportsbooks regarding player availability. When a team fails to meet those reporting standards properly, the league has every right to step in. According to reports, the Fever did not submit Clark's injury status within the required timeline. That's the issue. That's why the warning exists. And instead of addressing it with a calm, straightforward response like, "We understand the league's concerns, and we'll make sure procedures are handled correctly moving forward," Stephanie White walked into the press conference and immediately turned defensive. That's where James Boyd entered the story. And honestly, he deserves credit for simply doing what journalism is supposed to do. Boyd covers the Indianapolis Colts for The Athletic. He is not primarily a WNBA reporter, but what separated him in that moment was his willingness to keep asking follow-up questions after getting vague answers. White gave an evasive response. Boyd followed up again, then did it a third time, which in any normal press conference environment is completely standard journalism. But in that room, it suddenly felt shocking because almost nobody else was pressing for clarity. You could actually see the discomfort building during the exchange. Stephanie White kept responding as if the conversation was over, then realizing Boyd still had more questions. He challenged the idea that the organization had handled things the right way. He pointed out that reporters do not have direct access to team medical staff. He asked where the line exists between protecting private medical information and fulfilling league reporting responsibilities. Those are fair questions, completely fair. And the answers coming back were vague, defensive, and carefully worded without actually providing substance. Statements like, "I don't disclose anything that hasn't already been disclosed by our medical team or our franchise," sound official, but they don't actually clarify anything. It's the kind of answer designed to avoid specifics while appearing responsive. And honestly, this is where the situation starts becoming uncomfortable for the Fever organization itself. Because once you examine the timeline surrounding Caitlin Clark's injury designation, the questions become much harder to ignore. The frustration from fans, media members, and apparently even the league office itself centers on one key issue: timing. According to multiple reports and the discussions surrounding the incident, the Indiana Fever reportedly filed Caitlin Clark's injury report at 5 p.m. the following day. And that detail matters far more than people may realize. In professional sports, injury report deadlines are not just meaningless technicalities. They exist to protect competitive integrity. Media outlets rely on them to accurately inform the public. Opposing teams rely on them while preparing game plans. And leagues rely on them to maintain fairness around sports betting and player availability information. When a report arrives late, especially close to game time, much of its purpose disappears. By that point, the information no longer serves the people it was designed to serve. That's why Stephanie White's response created so much backlash. Because while the WNBA issued a formal warning implying procedures were not followed correctly, White stood at the podium insisting, "We did things the right way." That's not just awkward optics. That's a direct contradiction of the league office overseeing the franchise. The league effectively said, "This process was not handled properly." White responded, "Actually, it was. Both positions cannot be true at the same time." And honestly, the reported refiling the next day at 5 p.m. only intensified scrutiny. Because if everything had been handled correctly the first time, there would be no need to submit updated paperwork afterward. The very act of refiling raised obvious questions. To many observers, it looked less like clarification and more like acknowledgement that a correction needed to be made. But what makes this situation feel bigger than one injury report is the broader pattern people believe they've noticed throughout the season. Critics argue this press conference didn't happen in isolation. Instead, they see it as another example of Stephanie White appearing unusually restrained or hesitant whenever discussing Caitlin Clark publicly. There have been multiple moments this year where White was asked direct questions about Clark's impact, performances, or leadership, and the responses felt noticeably cautious. Supporters of White would argue that's part of maintaining a team-first culture, and to be fair, many coaches intentionally avoid placing too much attention on one player publicly. That philosophy exists across all sports, but critics believe there's a line between promoting team culture and repeatedly downplaying the significance of the player who has completely transformed the visibility of the franchise. Clark's impact on attendance, ratings, fan engagement, and national attention is impossible to ignore. She has become the central storyline of the league. So when praise feels limited or overly measured, people notice, which is why the press conference became even more interesting when Stephanie White unexpectedly delivered one of her strongest public endorsements of Caitlin Clark all season. White praised Clark's emotional intensity, her toughness attacking the rim, her defense, and the way she handled physicality during the game. For most coaches, that might sound routine, but for people who closely follow Fever press conferences, it stood out immediately because of how direct and detailed it was. Compared to White's earlier public comments throughout the season, the tone felt noticeably warmer. Naturally, fans and media immediately started asking why. Some observers believe the growing public criticism surrounding White's handling of Clark may have influenced the shift in messaging. Over the past several months, social media discussions and sports commentary questioning the relationship between coach and superstar have become increasingly loud. And while coaches often say they ignore outside noise, many people remain skeptical that organizations are completely unaffected by sustained public narratives. Whether the praise was completely organic or partly influenced by outside pressure is ultimately impossible to prove. But in the world of sports media and public perception, the impact is often the same either way. What fans hear publicly shapes how relationships inside a franchise are viewed, and this time, people finally heard Stephanie White speak about Caitlin Clark with a level of enthusiasm many had been waiting for all season. At the end of the day, the words are now on record. Stephanie White praised Caitlin Clark publicly, and Clark herself has never tried to turn any of this into drama. She's handled the situation professionally from the beginning. So now the bigger question becomes what all of this says about the Indiana Fever as an organization. Because when you zoom out, the injury report controversy, the defensive press conference, and the sudden shift in tone toward Clark all start looking connected. They paint a picture of a franchise still figuring out how to operate under a spotlight bigger than anything it has ever experienced before. The Fever are not just managing a talented young player. They are managing the single biggest asset in women's basketball right now. Caitlin Clark isn't only Indiana's franchise star. She's one of the driving forces behind the WNBA's explosion in ratings, attendance, sponsorships, and national relevance. Television deals are growing because of the attention surrounding her. Arenas are selling out because of her. Entire conversations around the league are changing because of her presence. That's why people are asking whether the Fever are truly maximizing this moment. And based on the public perception surrounding the organization lately, many fans and analysts feel the answer is still unclear. An injury report issue leading to a league warning is already a difficult headline. Following that with a combative press conference response only amplified the story. Instead of the focus staying on basketball, the attention shifted toward organizational communication and accountability. That's never where a franchise wants the conversation to go, especially during such a critical growth period for both the team and the league itself. None of this means the Fever are dysfunctional or incapable of success. Far from it. The roster is talented, the attention around the franchise is massive, and the opportunity in front of them is enormous. But situations like this suggest there are still communication gaps internally and externally that need to be cleaned up. Because once confusion becomes visible publicly, people naturally assume there's even more happening behind the scenes. And honestly, one of the biggest takeaways from the entire situation became the role of reporter James Boyd. Not because he did something outrageous, but because he did something surprisingly rare in that particular media environment. He kept asking follow-up questions. Boyd didn't accept vague answers and simply move on. He pressed for clarification multiple times. He asked about timelines, reporting procedures, and transparency. That's basic accountability journalism. Yet the reaction online made it seem extraordinary because many fans felt those questions had not been asked forcefully enough before. That reaction said a lot, and it reflected months of frustration from people who believed the Fever organization had avoided deeper scrutiny during key moments this season. Boyd's questions resonated because fans felt like someone was finally addressing the concerns they had been discussing online for weeks. At the same time, it's important to separate criticism of public communication from criticism of coaching ability. Stephanie White is a respected basketball coach. This conversation is less about whether she understands the game and more about how the organization is managing messaging, accountability, and public trust during one of the most high-pressure moments in franchise history. To White's credit, there were signs of adjustment afterward. The injury report was eventually addressed. Clark received direct public praise. The tone softened compared to the original defensive response. Whether that shift came naturally or partly because of outside criticism is impossible to know for certain. But from a public relations standpoint, the change still mattered, because right now every detail surrounding the Indiana Fever is magnified. Every late report, every awkward answer, every tense press conference becomes national conversation material. That's the reality of having the most talked about player in the sport. The standards become higher, and the margin for avoidable controversy becomes much smaller. Caitlin Clark's rise has created enormous opportunities for the Fever organization, but it has also created pressure that the franchise is still learning to navigate. Fans expect transparency. Media scrutiny is growing. National attention follows every move. And whether the organization likes it or not, the way they handle those moments shapes public trust just as much as wins and losses do. That's why this story became bigger than one injury report. For many people watching, it became a reflection of how the Fever are handling the responsibilities that come with leading the biggest basketball storyline in the country right now.